There we go.
Yeah.
Hello.
There we go. Hi.
Hello,
Hi,
everyone.
welcome. Yes. Welcome to Service Fabric Community Lucky 13.
Yeah. Off to a good start.
Oh boy.
So, shall we introduce the new guy in the room first?
Yes, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, my name is Alejandro. I'm a PM intern here in the Service Fabric team. Excited to work with you guys.
Very well.
Good.
Yes, bravo.
He will be answering all your questions today.
Yeah,
so
if you've been saving up hard questions. Now is
Leave
this
them
is the
for
week.
me.
Yeah, this is the week. We finally got an expert.
Finally, someone who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
All right.
So, as usual, feel free to unmute yourself, give us a question, let us know what's going on. You can also put your questions in the IM window, and we'll answer them there. But basically, we're here for you. Any other major announcements or things we want to talk about first?
No, I don't think there's anything that's particularly this week that's kind of come up. Well, we got past build, and hopefully everyone we talked about, because we had one just after build.
This is our first time for build.
No, immediately after build.
This
So we
is
talked a bit about build then. So build's gone past. If you didn't see any of the build videos, go back and watch some of those. Outside of that,
We got a question.
we had a new release that came out just after build. So we're on 5.6.
5.6.
We could talk about that. Then the 5.7 build is coming out in July.
Yeah.
So that's the next one that's being targeted for. So that's on our regular cadence of about every 8 weeks with the new feature release. That one's coming out, and then of course we'll then target a build that's after that. 8 weeks later. So that's sort of a bit of the roadmap. I know a lot of people ask about roadmaps, so maybe we could spend a bit of time talking about some of the things inside 5.7 at some point. But let's dive into community questions first.
Yeah.
Okay, there's a first question from
Marston. Hi, Marston.
I think Mark.
No,
There was one at the top.
okay.
Is there one?
So is there a
Shuffle my window.
limit to the number of node types in a cluster? So there isn't a limit which we impose from a Service Fabric perspective as to how many node types you can have. The only limit which we place is you cannot use large VMSs at this point.
And that's a VM scale set with
So
more than.
What is a large VMSS? Large VMSS basically is an attempt from VMSS to allow customers to go up to 1,000 instances. So the way they've implemented it does not allow us to use them because there are the FDs and UDs which come out as a topology for us are not comparable, and so we cannot use it for placement and load balancing. So the way you would do that is to add more. If you need more nodes in your cluster, you add more node types. So there isn't a limit which we impose. We ourselves have tried up to 1,000, like we showed that in the demo at build. So there isn't a limit. If you're seeing any limits, they're wrong. So the only reason why Portal has a limit of 3 is because of just convenience and UI. And typically, we've not seen any customers go beyond 300 nodes. So that is one of the reasons why we ended up with that. But if there is a specific reason why you need to go beyond 10 node types, let us know. We can work with you if you run any issues into limits from the VNets and so forth. So, all right. So that answers that question. Was there anything else on that?
Yeah, I think that was that. Let's go into Martin's one about single node on standalone.
Okay, so good thing which happened after build is the standalone release did happen. So we have that out there.
Way to go.
So
Good job.
good job. So we plan to support one node in the standalone cluster soon. We don't have a date for it. The main reason why So the main reason why we did not do that in the first place was internal thinking from our team. The internal team, the standalone team was, you already have a way to create test clusters using the SDK, and that is already on the standalone side of things. So we didn't realize that there was a need for it. So now that there's an ask, there's actually multiple asks for it. So we have scheduled it. It's going to be out there soon. I don't have a date for it.
Well, when we say
that means you can actually go and create a cluster.json, which will be one node.
Okay. So soon as next release, then yes. Or don't you?
Do not want to put words into my mouth. No, my boss already has that habit. That's how he pushes.
All right, so we're working on that, Martin. It's a huge deal for you.
That's really great to hear. Thanks a lot. This is really huge for me.
Good.
No problem.
Yes. Anything that you want, we'll fix. Okay, that's good. All right, Lander's question.
Okay, I'll take this one. Background info given a web queue worker architecture where the web front end is an ASP.NET Core website. Okay, and that web queue worker architecture, if you follow that link, that shows you something similar to what was recommended with cloud services, where you have a web front end sends data off to a queue, and workers in the back end just pull off the queue and process it. So that's a typical architecture of software. So questions are: is it possible to use reliable collections in the ASP.NET Core website? And according to this documentation, recommends only having stateless ASP.NET Core services. So in the documentation, it only recommends stateless ASP.NET Core services for externally facing ASP.NET Core applications.
For the front end.
So the front end, whatever is exposed out to the public internet, we generally don't recommend making that stateful. Mainly because there's really no good way for ingress traffic to reach that service, because you have to do some partition resolution to find the appropriate partition and replica to talk to. So generally don't recommend that. Also because your stateful services, we usually think of those as kind of a back-end data store, and generally you don't want to expose direct access to your back-end data store out to the public. Usually you have some buffer between. Similar to how you wouldn't expose your database connection string out to the public and just let them connect directly. Yeah. So the answer is yes, you can definitely do a stateful ASP.NET Core service, and you can use reliable collections in there. The documentation that you link to, I believe, has an example of that, showing you how to use stateful ASP.NET Core service using Kestrel. But if not, if you go onto GitHub in our samples, just our getting started sample, that has a stateful ASP.NET Core service that uses reliable collections. So you can take a look at that and see how that works.
Thank you for answering that. Just to clarify, I meant to say that you wouldn't recommend using it collections in that web front end in this architecture, correct?
Right, that's right. Just because if that web front end, if you expose that out to your users aren't really going to be able to connect to that service.
Yeah, there has to be something else kind of proxying or redirecting the traffic in front of it. Yeah, and that's usually that stateful service.
Exactly. Now you can do, if you're not serving up a UI, if it's just a web API or an HTTP API, what you can do is you can have that stateful ASP.NET Core service kind of as your front end, but not exposed directly to users. What you do is you front that with something like Azure API Management, which knows how to intelligently route traffic to the correct partition and replica of the service. But you can't just send user traffic through the Azure Load Balancer directly to a stateful service, because the Azure Load Balancer isn't smart enough to figure out which node the stateful service partition and replica is on that you need to route the traffic to. So something has to sit in front of it.
Thank you.
And that's where we typically recommend that thing sitting in front of it in the back end, using a reverse proxy to do the calls to the stateful service.
Yeah, so you can do, so the reverse proxy knows how to route traffic to a specific partition replica of a stateful service, but the caller has to specify a partition key and also the name of the service. Now, generally, your front-end users aren't going to know how to generate that partition key. And more importantly, you actually don't want them to know that, because that's an implementation detail. Yeah. And you don't want to give your users control of partitioning. You don't want them to be able to choose which partition to go to, because that's going to make your whole system just
typically
explode.
You want to hide those details.
You want to hide those details, right? Exactly. Now you can, so that's where API management comes in. If you put API management in front of that, then you control the partitioning scheme, and the API that your users get from their perspective looks just like a regular stateless web service.
Well, now you've mentioned API management, do you want to, maybe we could save that for a little bit in the question about what's coming up with that thing?
Well, let me get to the other 2 points here that we have in the question. Then and then we can talk about that a little bit. So the second part of the question then is, what message queue do you recommend using with Service Fabric? It really depends on what kind of features you need out of that queuing. So we have a couple of reliable queues that ship with Service Fabric, but they are basic queues. So there's the reliable queue, which is a strict FIFO queue. That's the one we've had for a while, and then we now have the concurrent reliable queue, which was just introduced at the Build conference a month ago. And that one is not strict FIFO. It allows you to do concurrent writes and concurrent reads, so multi-producer, multi-consumer, and it relaxes the strict FIFO semantics. Now, if you need additional functionality, like taking out leases on queue items so that when you're processing the queue item, you can take out a lease on it, and if the processing failed, it goes back onto the queue. Our queues don't provide that functionality. You'd have to build that on top.
Things like dead letter queuing.
Yeah, dead letter, poison message handling,
right.
Yeah, all that good stuff.
All that message statistics type stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to manage the queue yourself, if you don't want to manage having to scale it out and provision it and all this goodness, if you use the reliable queue, you would have to write a reliable service that wraps it and provides an API to be able to use it from other services. So you can use, there's of course Azure queues, Azure storage queues, which has been around forever. That's a great one to use. That's typical in the architecture that you pointed to
And
here.
then there was Todd's priority queue that he wrote as well.
Sure, that's an example.
Yes,
yeah,
right,
that's an example of when you would some of the stuff that you would do if you wanted to provide higher level queuing capabilities directly on top of the data structures that Service Fabric provides.
Yeah,
there's always Service Bus,
and there's Service Bus. Service Bus gives you all kinds of advanced functionality with topics and subscriber
and then again, it really does depend upon what type of messaging that you're doing. So, for example, you might even go as far as using something like Event Hub.
Yeah.
Typically, we see Event Hub more as an ingress thing, where it's the boundary between the clients outside the cluster and what's going on inside the cluster.
Yeah.
But if your message rates and throughput are high enough, and your messages are these small event type things, then nothing says you can't use Event Hub for that link as well.
And we've seen that as well, where Event Hub is just an internal component where the ingress service actually publishes events out to Event Hub, and then a backend service goes and reads from it. So that's a possibility too. So you do have a few options there depending on what you want to accomplish. Now that leads into your third question, which is recommendation for resources to implement the architecture. So this, you can actually take the same approach that you had with web and worker rules, where you have a stateless web API in the front, a stateless service in the back, and a queue between them. That's still perfectly valid, and you can continue to do that. But you can also do more advanced scenarios. And like Matt mentioned, if you're bringing in Event Hub, you can do some more interesting things like a stateful service on the back end, where you match the partition count of the stateful service with the partition count in your Event Hub, and then you have a one-to-one mapping of partitions. And we actually have an example of this out on GitHub too. This is our Service Fabric IoT sample. If you search for Service Fabric IoT on GitHub, you'll find that. So check that out. That's one example of how to read from something kind of like a queue using the Event Hub APIs. I don't know if we have any other resources available for this specifically.
I put up the migration guide, which touches on some of these patterns.
Oh, right. Yes, that's right. Yeah, thanks for reminding me. We do have a Cloud Services to Service Fabric migration guide. I should know. I wrote that one.
Yeah.
It's okay. That's okay. I forget these things. That one will give you a little bit of an overview of going from Service Fabric to Cloud Services to Service Fabric, and taking one architecture, converting it to the other, and you'll see that you can actually keep the same overall architectural style. It's just a matter of replacing worker roles and web roles with stateless services. So hope that answers most of that one.
Yeah. If you have any further questions on that or want to dig into any of those details, just ask us in the chat line. We'll get to it.
We can follow up with additional.
Thank you guys very much.
No problem.
No problem.
Antonio.
I'll take this one. I just discovered a problem with the actor not keeping state. State persistence persisted in the actor class definition. It's a partial class implemented in 3 sharp files. I haven't seen this particular issue, Antonio, so if you could, I think I left nope, I will get that link. If you could come over to the issues list that we keep on GitHub, and I will paste that link promptly. There you go. If you can come over to that issues list on GitHub and talk through this issue more with us, just open one up and let us know what you're seeing and what you've implemented. Little code snippets will help. We can involve the right people and see what the situation is. I wouldn't necessarily expect you to have to do it that way. So we should figure out more of this. I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Yeah, the persisted flag, you shouldn't need to put that on all your partial classes because persisted is the default.
Right.
So if you don't put anything, that's what you get by default.
So it's weird that that's not happening.
It's kind of strange. We have so if you go onto GitHub in our open source repo for actors and services, you can post an issue there and then we can pick it up.
Oh yeah, you can do it on the actual SDK as well. Either way.
I'll paste a link to that.
Yeah. No, either way. Yeah.
Yeah, let me paste a link to the repo there.
Yep.
I think that's probably the best place to go.
But let's go figure that out.
Yeah, we'll figure that one out for you.
Okay.
Guidelines around caller and calling semantics. Service A called service B and now waiting for a response. Oh, I have to keep my finger on this
Default
thing.
timeout at one time in the service partition client is like 5 minutes. Yeah. You overrun by running your own factory and creating a service partition client, and then you pass in special timeouts. Yep. Service A at this time. Yeah. Yeah. So there's some retries built into into service proxy, which you can use in order to control those retries and backoffs and when it eventually gives up. But whether or not you're done or whether or not you want to have further retries when that does timeout is kind of up to the application. We've seen a lot of people wrap the basic communication APIs with retry policies, with circuit breaker pattern stuff that they get from some library. We've seen a lot of use of Poly, which is a C# library that provides a lot of these back-off, retry, circuit breaker, caching semantics. We've seen people use that to pretty good effect to implement these types of back-off and retry policies without having to go write all that code yourself. So whether or not you want to use the basics that are provided by the service proxy classes themselves, or whether or not you just want to have it be basically fire and forget and then wrap it in something like Poly to get some of those higher order semantics and patterns, that is kind of left up as a implementation choice. Basically just because Service Fabric doesn't really know what you're communicating, what the importance of it is. So for certain types of communication, you might want to bail out, retry, and return some error to the user immediately. Or you might want to, it's not maybe super latency sensitive, and so you will sit there and try over and over again for some seconds. But it is kind of a choice, and it is a choice that there's probably not one size fits all, even within your application. Different communication channels probably have different requirements. So that's kind of how we'd recommend. I'll grab a link to Poly and dump it in the chat window in case somebody. Great.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. It looks like Mark's already grabbed it, but
yes, I've seen quite a lot of people who use this. Last week I was sitting with a set of customers, and one of them had used it, and they were pretty pleased with it.
Yeah, it's actually fairly. It's a really good library. Yes. It's got a lot of things in it.
Okay, next one up is Marcin again, asking on what's new in backup and restore.
Did we skip some?
We skipped one. Is there a way to enable login and reverse proxy for debugging?
Logging on the reverse proxy.
So we're on that right now.
We actually are on that right now. Yeah, we're adding some pretty detailed logging to reverse proxy. So it'll you'll have a switch, kind of like IIS logs. Think of it that way. So you'll be able to switch between verbose logging, where it'll log every request that comes through, and then a non-verbose mode, which you want to use in production probably, where it only logs
when you want
error responses or error codes. So yeah, so that's coming. You'll have more detailed logging coming up in reverse proxy. Does that go to app insights? How did we do that?
Well, it should technically be agnostic to it. So it should be functional with any platform you want to use to visualize those logs.
But it's part of the event stream.
Yes.
The event source channel that we already have.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's in the works. You can expect that soon.
Great. So now we can do Martin's one.
Yes.
I can restore. So there's
anything new?
Well, anything new? Well, there's the backup and restore. We're working on this thing called a backup and restore service. Yes?
Right.
And that's a very straightforward thing. It simply looks at all the partitions inside your service and calls Azure backup and restore and makes a copy of the backup from that partition into Azure blob storage.
Yep.
I believe is it.
Yep. And so you get the ability to do basic scheduling and policy configured on that backup and restore service, where you say things like, here are the number of incremental backups I want, here are the number of full backups I want to keep, here's where to keep them, you keep them in blob storage, here's the frequency and the schedule that I want to have for when those backups get taken. And you also get APIs around restore, so that if something does happen, it's an API call to Azure Backup that will restore, say, the latest backup directly into the service. Previously, you had to go write a bunch of code for this, and one of our samples, the web reference one, does show that backup and restore code that you had to write previously. A lot of that goes away and becomes the job of this backup and restore service.
And do we have a date? When do you think you have a preview for that?
I don't have an updated one. It's kind of one of those things where there's a few scenarios left that we're trying to finish out. So I think it's
July-ish.
Yeah, ideally it would be 5.7. It might go to 5.8, but it should be in there. It's coming in. It's mostly done. We have demos of it showing. I think that there's even a rough sketch video of it that we posted at some point.
We did push that internally. Yes.
Yeah. Well, if you're no, it's not. It's the Yammer group. I thought it went there. So it is there, and that gives you an idea of what does exist. It is an area that we're actively working on.
So I think expect something in the next month.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Let's see. Bunch of links from us.
This one. Server call.
Server call. How do you call a service fabric service from within a container? Server call container.
Call from containers to the microservices.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you could bake the SDK into the
You could do
container.
that. Yeah, you'd have to have the SDK installed in the container.
That's one way to do it. Yep.
Well, you need the NuGet packages. The question is, would you need the runtime installed? I think you might.
You might need the runtime installed, but it wouldn't be doing anything. It wouldn't be a part of the cluster.
It wouldn't be a part of the cluster, no. But I think you'd need there because there are certain assemblies that you need gacked in order to be used all this stuff.
Yeah, that's true today.
But
So
usually you would do HTTP communications. Right?
Well,
yeah. So I mean, in general,
agnostic.
yeah, and I think this is what we showed at Build is we had two services that were containerized and they were talking to each other over the reverse proxy. So that was using HTTP communication. And then the service discovery part was handled by the reverse proxy between the two containers. But for service proxy, that requires at least our NuGet packages, possibly the runtime. I'd have to check on that.
Yeah, we'll have to try that one out.
Yeah.
I think we have to do a bit more investigation on that one.
Yeah, but that could be why you're seeing outbound calls not allowed. They might just be failing because the dependencies aren't there. There's nothing that we know of that prevents outbound communication. If you map the ports per the standard expose rules in your Docker files, those should be getting picked up. And
unless you're running into the loopback issue.
Oh, sure, that is possible. So there are some known Windows bugs.
Yeah, there's another question on that.
In particular, which I guess we'll probably talk about in a second, because there's another question on that.
Okay.
This question. While using reliable collections, when the primary writes to a primary, the data automatically gets replicated to the secondary. Let's assume this data is.
Yep. So
Post processing. Oh, notifications.
Yeah, and I will post a link. But the answer to this is there's something that we have called notifications, which are change events on the collection. So you basically hook an event up to that changed event, and then you get this callback whenever something happens on the collection. That change happens as a part of the actual commit, as a part of committing that transaction. So if something, if you were building an index or doing this sort of processing and that processing failed for any reason, the whole operation fails. So that you never get out of sync, right? Your operations that you're doing on the collections and whatever you're doing in this post-processing work are always in sync. And so that's where you would hook up this type of post-processing stuff. And again, we've seen people use it to build caches, pre-built views, indices, do logging, all sorts of stuff.
Building views is a common one.
Yeah, most common. Yep.
Yes.
And is it good to assume, since this happens in the context of a commit, you have to be quick. Otherwise, your caller is still waiting. Your primary cannot move forward because the commit has not returned.
Yeah, your primary might still be able to move forward because it's not when you do transactions on a collection in Service Fabric, you're not locking the whole collection. You're locking more like the row. So any other operation on that row would be blocked, but other things can go in parallel. So it's worth noting that the callbacks that you get will be in order for the changes within a particular transaction, right? So if you touch key 1 and then touch key 2 in 2 dictionaries in a transaction, those notifications will show up in order. But unless you're touching the same rows in a different transaction, those other transactions events will show up interwoven. So it's only ordered within a given transaction, which is correct. It's buildable.
The transaction has to finish, right? The
Yeah.
transaction itself has
The event has to finish in order for the transaction to finish. And so yes, you're absolutely right. Generally, you always want transactions to be tiny and quick. And so I wouldn't do too many complicated things in those callbacks. But it is a place where if you're going to insert something in a collection in memory to build a view, even if it's just a bunch of pointers back to other stuff in the collections, that's where you would do it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's take the loopback bug. So the loopback bug is an issue inside containers today where you can't effectively call between containers using localhost. It's a Windows container, Windows networking issue that that's effectively a bug/feature. We've actually been working with them. Actually, just this week I've been working with them to get this fixed, and we're hoping that this will get addressed in a full release, effectively, of Windows that comes out then, so that you can then do container-to-container calls with effectively through localhost.
Yeah.
Today, right now, you have to do the IP address of the actual host itself if you want to call between things.
So that explains the service proxy not working then, because service proxy by default uses a default fabric client, and the fabric client by default uses a localhost to talk to the fabric gateway, which is where it does the service lookup, service discovery. So what you can do is, instead of just using service proxy.create, you can use the service proxy factory, which allows you to plug in your own fabric client. And then what you can do is plug in your own fabric client and give it the IP of the machine. And that way, that should get around that loopback issue. So that's
so this particular question about .NET Core, you should not hit this problem.
You shouldn't have a problem because you're not in a container.
Yeah, it's container specific. So anything about
Exactly.
it doesn't matter about the .NET framework version. It doesn't matter what type of code you're using, and it shouldn't be a problem with guest exes. It's strictly a problem.
Well,
Containers.
guest X is in containers or not in containers? If it's not in if it guest
I
X
think he means that.
I mean, it's strictly a container problem. So if you're in a container, you'll see it. If you're not in a container, you will not see it, regardless of anything else.
I thought it was all about containers. Yes, you'll see the problem case. And they say you have to use the full IP address.
Yeah,
that's today.
But that's
the way
just
around.
that's just looping back to the original question about loopbacks. See what I did there? I'll see myself.
Yeah, you can. You're tapped out.
So, a question about the Azure German cloud and the delays that it takes to get there. So I guess first part is how long does it take?
This is for you, Shaka. Our local German cloud, so it's as in there was how do we do rollouts to our national clouds?
And also, I think maybe instead of Azure Stack, since that's not a product that has shipped yet, Marcin might mean standalone again, but it's going to be a relevant question. Anyway.
So when we roll out something, a new release, when we announce a new release, we start our rollouts, and we would at least be midway before we announce publicly. Typically, we wait for a worldwide deployment. The sovereign clouds come the second wave. So in this case, the specific example you're giving, where on the Black Forest sovereign cloud, there was
meaning the German
one.
Schwarzwald, if you're local.
Yes. So we had a rollout problem with our software which rolls it out. So it was delayed by close to 10 days, and there was a CSA locally who made us aware of it, and so we fixed it. But in general, the intent would be that it would be there at the time of our announcement or just soon after. There should not be any issues with that statement. So as of today, yes, that particular preview is there, that 2017-0701. It was made available before yesterday. It's in all the national clouds, including Fairfax.
Which is
the U.S. government.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we don't call it the same outside.
They don't know. National clouds. Countries. They think of countries. Yes.
Okay.
Not aliases.
Never mind.
The Bill conference, a conference in mid-May. We had to teach ourselves to say these things. Yes.
I will remember. So then we're also talking about maybe there needs to be some more predictability, and we may end up having a schedule which will post externally if there is any issues like this happening in the future.
Yeah.
So
He gets a-
Sandro is still having problem with reverse proxy.
Yeah,
So
we have an issue on GitHub actually open for this one.
okay, yeah, I would
Yeah.
say for those kind of troubleshooting thing, go
Yeah.
to GitHub, raise an issue there, and we'll
Yeah.
help you out.
But so that issue is actually already open. We know about this one. This is a problem with again Windows NAT when communicating from the host to the container. So presumably you're having trouble running in a container here. And so the only way to get around this currently is to have two node types. And then put your reverse proxy on one of those node types,
And the
then
container on
container on the other one, and then go through that. So unfortunately, Windows containers still have these NAT issues, and there are weird.
Mark is in like total
Yeah,
shock.
well, that's why I was
Yeah.
hounding the Windows team yesterday on this issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's another thing, and you're gonna dump the link into the window. So if you're having that issue, come upvote the issue.
Yeah, and these are great that you're raising them because
Yeah.
I've got even more ammunition now to send to the Windows team.
Yes, please
Straight after
please
this.
help us
It's entirely
help you.
free,
yeah.
And this entire thread I'll send to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We had an issue with actor reminders trigger when the actors were moved to a different node. Actor created a bunch of reports at the end of the month. 2552526.
Was there a fix? Indeed, a fix in 5.6. Yeah.
That we got addressed.
Yeah.
No, not just luck.
Or maybe both.
Or maybe both.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
no, we fixed that one.
And I think that's in the release notes. If we go
It should be in the
look at
release notes in
Yeah.
5.6. Yeah.
Yeah, addresses that particular issue.
These things.
So you may also be lucky, but that was an actual
But we have
issue.
to-
So that's
What's
good.
the timeline on
Yeah.
getting SF libraries fully on .NET Core and the full framework dependency?
So that's mid-September, which is the Ignite conference. At that point, we plan to release our entire SDK on .NET Standard 2.0.
Yeah.
And so at that point, you can compile your services either to .NET Core 2.0 or .NET 4.6.1 full .NET Framework. You'll have your choice there.
Yep.
So .NET Standard is on the way. Well, 4.6.1 or above, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, cool. Another question for ASP.NET Core.
That's in there.
How do you configure ASP.NET Core Secret Manager tool?
I'm not familiar with that.
Not familiar with that tool, so I'll have to look that up and then tell you.
Yes, don't know.
Um,
I presume you're referring to how they store secrets with their middleware provider and how
This
maybe
is-
that tool accesses it. I think that's what the question's about.
We're saying the problem is because user secrets are stored under your user account and are inaccessible to services running as network service. So I think sounds like the solution is just running your service as a different account.
Yeah, I mean, you can run you can run any one of your services under a different account using run as capability. And so that way, if that's the issue, and you want to run it under a specific account because you've got a Windows Active Directory domain joined, which is on premise or in Azure, you can run it under a locally generated local user account. You can do that, and then maybe that might solve it.
So yeah. I mean, we would recommend you using the way of encrypting your secrets into the configuration as part of your Service Fabric services, and you will be able to do that both in your development environment as well as running in production. So, I mean, just briefly looking through the secret management tool thing, which seems to be has some maybe where you're stumbling is the integration with Visual Studio and the .NET Core projects that you use for Service Fabric services. I'm not sure. But you should probably look at how you can encrypt secrets into Service Fabric configuration and use that path instead.
And I just pasted a link to documentation on that.
Yeah, that's typically how we would recommend you do it, is instead of using these other things, you can use the settings.xml that ships as a part of your Service Fabric application package and service packages. There's means that we give you for dumping secrets into those config files, making sure that they're encrypted, so that if the machine is compromised, there's no environment variables that you have to worry about getting exposed. And if you look at the resources on disk, all you see are encrypted values. And then there's APIs for reading those values out and doing the decryption within your service code, so that you get your key that you need to go talk to some other service out. That's generally how we recommend you do it in the link that Voss posted.
And
has those
and that will
details.
work both across dev and production. Right?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
It's uniform. But we will, if you want us to address the particular secret thing, do come and open an issue saying, hey, this integration is busted. And we can take a look at it and maybe learn more about it, talk with the ASP.NET Core guys, and see if there's anything we can do to make it work better together. That's something we can talk about.
Yeah, and if you do post that issue, our ASP.NET Core integration, that's also open source. So I just posted a link to that.
Yeah, go there.
You can open up an issue there. We can take a further look at it.
Yep.
Oh, I see.
Let's
What's
see
the
here.
practical network latency for service fabric system services? What is the practical network latency required for reliable collections to work correctly? This is from Mars.
Yeah, so correctly, they will always work correctly. They might not work fast, is the result.
So even if it's a 30-minute latency, it would still be correct.
If it's a 30-minute latency, we're going to take that node out of rotation because something is screwed up. So practically what will happen is that it'll get slower until such a time that the latency is so bad that Service Fabric determines that the node is unhealthy. So we have these checks that are happening all the time at the network layer, where basically if machines can't talk, if the network is isolated, then we will remove the machine from the cluster. We'll crash it and bring it back and see if that fixes it. So your latency can increase up to the point where we kick the machine out of the network. Now, there are classes of networking errors that might affect not the least traffic, but actually do affect the collections for some reason. If they're communicating over different ports or NICs or something like that, then you can get divergent behavior where the machine thinks that it is fine, Service Fabric thinks that the machine is fine, but your collections are experiencing a lag or latency or jitter or all sorts of problems at their use of the network. And what you see in those cases is that things generally just slow down. If your primary is trying to run ahead, if it's trying to do all this work, then what happens is that basically you'll get situations where the primary's queue, the work that it's sending out to the secondaries, will fill up. And at that point, there's some buffer that we keep of operations. And if it can't make progress, it's just dumping things in there, but nothing's really happening. Eventually, that queue will fill up, and then we'll start rejecting operations. So it's really kind of built to be resilient to these types of network issues, with the caveat that it will get slower and it might consume more resources while it's trying to kind of buffer or ride over these types of transient errors. But the idea is that those latency things, if they're uniform, if they're going to cause kind of problems for everything, that node just gets kicked out, the workload fails over and resumes somewhere else. So that's kind of the idea.
But if you're observing any such one, please file an incident, because I'm really interested in figuring out if there is something like this happening outside. We've noticed some in our own runs. Typically, it's the Fabric controller deciding that particular node is not available, but we are finding it to be okay. So if this is a theoretical question, I think he answered the question for you. If it's which is happening and you've
yeah,
seen
if you're seeing a practical case where this is happening, file an incident. We'll take a look at this. We'll take a look at the specifics.
Yeah.
The thing I'm sorry. The thing I wanted to understand is if cluster can practically run on latencies like 80 milliseconds or 40 milliseconds like large geo-distributed clusters.
Oh yeah, no, that's still pretty quick.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's when you start getting up into seconds that things get a little rough.
I mean,
okay, so it's practical and imaginable that we can have in future a cluster spanning multiple regions and working quite correctly and quite fast.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the speed of light. So if everything is operating correctly, that's usually snappy enough for production use. Yeah. Sample event source, service event source code generated by the service product creation template in Visual Studio. And they run a tight, small operation. Color tracing with the classes appear to drop in the Visual Studio event diagnostics window.
Interesting. It's a lot of traces.
Yeah. ETW does drop traces in the sense that they will not get emitted if it's over a certain limit that the machine can't process. So it is possible that it is there. We see that in fairly heavy usage of ETW that you will get trace loss or event loss. That's just it's basically ETW has a cap on how many resources it's going to eat tracing things out for you. So you can always increase those limits, but in practice, that's only when things are going a little bit sideways.
So we do have Carol on the line. I don't know if
Yeah, so I just wanted to add that also diagnostics window has a limit of how many traces it will show, and when it exceeds, I think, 200 traces per second, it will start to basically drop them. So, but you should see like a warning in the UI telling you that it's happening.
Yeah, I'm not that concerned about the UI because UI is just for debugging. But in real production environment, if we are using a high throughput, low latency system, and the actual ETW trace file that is getting written, which I think is some form of a memory mapped implementation, because the spec of the event source class, which is available on the internet from Microsoft, says that the internal testing at Microsoft, 100,000 per second can be easily handled by ETW.
Yeah,
and a million a second will like swamp your machine. So that's a very high number, and then here I'm dropping messages. So this could be a bug, or like as this other gentleman mentioned, a limit of just the Visual Studio. Diagnostic.
And it's almost certainly just in the diagnostics window. Do check to see if there is trace loss. There are ways to do that.
Yeah.
Where ETW will tell you if it's dropping events. If there, I think there's a perf counter for it or something we can find out. But there is a way to go find that out if you need to.
So, but I think we should. There is, from the practical perspective, I've had customers who reported that finally, how do you get your traces out? Will be the diagnostics extension which you deployed. Even that has a limit. So basically, it hits the physical limit of the machine, and then basically it will drop. So if you see such a drop, you have to, for all practical purposes, you have to reduce the amount of traces you write in, right? And that is what you will have to do. So I've seen big large tier 1 customers rethink as to how much of traces they need to really write and to make it useful without loss. So it has nothing to do with the ETW stack itself.
Okay.
It's the ability to pump it out.
Question from Steven.
Thank you.
For on-prem, does reverse proxy fail if the node being addressed goes down? So for example, my external client app connection string is referencing node 1 and is passing the call to node 4 because node 1 does not have the service I'm calling for, but then node 1 goes down. Do my calls start to fail? Well, they will if your client's hard-coded to send request to node 1, but typically you don't do that, right? Typically you have a load balancer in front of all your nodes that can send requests out to all of your front-end nodes, and the load balancer is typically smart enough, or at least has some kind of way of checking to see which nodes are up. So it has a back-end pool, effectively, and it will take nodes out of rotation if they can't be reached. So I would recommend against having your clients connect directly to a specific node IP address, because then, if that node goes down, client won't be able to connect anymore. So use a load balancer for that.
Yeah.
The reverse proxy is going to run on every node. Yeah. Well, you can configure per node type, but within a node type, it'll run on every single node. So as long as a load balancer is sending traffic across all the nodes in a node type, you'll be able to connect to at least one of them and connect to the reverse proxy that way.
Yep. So while we're at this topic, a lot of customers have asked me about, or asked Deep and I about giving some guidance on how to set up a load balancer on-prem. Not many people have i5s in front. So we're writing down a guidance as to how you can use the Windows 2016 operating system to set up a load balancer.
Cool.
And that would help this matter.
Yeah, because that's the last question is, the way you don't know about nodes is you talk to something like a standard network balancer that is going to spray the traffic across all the nodes in the cluster, and then your clients don't have to know anything. They just have to know the that load balancer, and then they're done.
I guess we take this for granted in Azure because we always give you a load balancer for your nodes. But on-prem, you have to set up a load balancer yourself. That's right.
Let's see here.
There's one on AAD next, I think.
Event sourcing. I see.
Event sourcing plan to be able for more than the logging.
There's some Daniel.
What are you looking for, Daniel?
Maybe if you could give us a little more information about what you're trying to do. There isn't an event sourcing framework that is built into Service Fabric today, but we have seen people build like CQRS systems on top of Service Fabric, where they're using messaging in the communication stack, they have the dictionary events, all this type of stuff, to build an event sourcing system where things flow through the cluster. But we don't give you any of that today. It is something we've thought about, but it's not something that we have in the works at this time. If you have a specific concern or question about that one, do let us know. What are you guys doing?
Someone can't see us and they want to see us.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
video.
Hi, I'm Daniel.
Video is all black. Well, we decided to.
Yeah, it works. I can see you again. Thank you.
Turn the lights on.
Yeah, we've been sitting in a room with all the lights off.
For like an hour.
You finally got on.
It's not a chat bot.
Yeah. It turns out we're actual humans.
Oh God.
Sorry to disappoint you. The AI is not that good yet.
Okay, Active Directory integration. The Active Directory integration isn't too hard. It basically goes, say I'll post the example of, say you're doing it from a single page application. You have to include one of the libraries that they ship. So for example, in a single page application, they ship a thing called app.js, which allows you to authenticate with AAD, and then you get back a token, and it does that over OAuth 2. And then effectively you hand that token in your REST call to the Service Fabric service that you're calling. And inside that Service Fabric service, you typically add a property in there. I think they have a C# probably called AAD auth, that basically says that when this service gets called, it expects an AAD auth token in the REST call that comes to it all. I'll see if I can find an example.
But with the integrated authentication, there is an option to run your services under a specific user account.
Yes.
Right? In your cluster?
Yes.
You can specify that as part of your manifest.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
So if you're in the main context, you would be able to do that, and then your service will practically run as that identity, and you can.
Yeah. So it is. Yeah. So this is different. I was talking about AAD.
Yeah, you can set it up. You can set up your service up to run as either like a domain user or even specific local users and groups.
Yeah.
On machines.
This is on premise.
Yeah, and then well, I mean, even in Azure, you can technically do it. As local user, you just say, not Redmond Mathsnyder, but localhost, Bob. Yeah. And then you can put that into a particular group and do things like that.
And you can make localhost Bob on the other node.
Yes, it does. Yeah. And then they're able to communicate directly.
So I think, Danilo, you tried to come in with your question before. You can unmute and.
Oh, hi. I was trying to talk before. I wrote it down in the chat, but basically I would like to use event sourcing for communication between microservices instead of using an external message stack like RabbitMQ that we are using currently in our company.
Yeah, unfortunately we don't have anything built today, but if you can, that's a common scenario. We have seen people build things on top of us. It is something we're investigating, but we don't have anything planned. So if you want to go with a full like CQRS event source type thing, your best bet at this point is to build it in, and then you're ending up with direct service-to-service communication based on those events. And that is a good. I like that model because it does help ensure consistency in the sense that if something happens here, I know that a message is going to show up. It might not show up immediately. It's kind of up to the implementation choice whether you want that to be kind of transactional or not. But it does help make sure, yep, I got this list of events. I know what I need to push up the hill to the other services to make sure that they see those events, and then they can trigger other actions based on that. So eventing within a service, writing down what messages or events you need to send somewhere else, sending them, getting some sort of acknowledgement, and then kind of checking them off and sweeping them out. That sort of event model where you're pushing events around in the cluster between services is something that basically all communication boils down to within the cluster. So that is something that's pretty common.
So Stephen asked how to connect his newly installed on-premise cluster. And I think you said the doc says you need the cluster fully qualified domain name. Basically comes down to I don't know if you had a question about the load balancer before, but you need to find an IP address that actually is a cluster or a cluster node.
So the way to think about on-premise, it's unlike Azure, you don't get a virtual IP. So there isn't one domain which we give you. In fact, what we just talked about, like what you just talked about here, as long as your my service cluster happens to be the name of one of your machines, you're good. So that will be a fully qualified name. Like if it is my machine out here, it will be jackdan3.microsoft. Blah, blah, blah. So that is what this one is. The other example, what Mikhail was talking about, is you can actually use IPv4 address as well.
Yeah, I mean, you might want to start off that. So you do the IP address 172.3.5, whatever. And then the name of the, and then the port, colon 19,000 to be able to connect to it all.
Yeah, we also typically see.
Make sure you remove the HTTP from the front.
Yeah, if you want to talk directly to the cluster and you have that connectivity, it's not isolated behind some subnet or barrier or network load balancer or IP base or anything like that. When you go connect Service Fabric cluster in PowerShell, for example, there's actually an option to have a array of addresses, and what you can do is you can put right in there the actual IPv4 address is in port 19,000 for all of the nodes in the cluster, and you're off and running, and you're connected. Typically, though, you end up with this sort of barrier. You end up with some appliance or some network space, or the network of the cluster ends up isolated, so you can't just hit it from your desktop. And that's when you end up plumbing that port through that load balancer or NAT or whatever you got, so that you hit that public DNS name or that public IP address, and it gets sprayed and just hits some random node in the cluster, and then everything else continues to work.
I'll publish. There's a doclink example inside here. I'll probably point to you to.
Yeah, and then it's if your IP address is not working, you sort of make sure that that particular machine is alive.
Yeah, ping it.
Ping it. So that is the other downfall I've seen is customers just hardcode that particular IP address into their operations manual, and if that particular machine is down, then you hit some other machine. So that's because you don't have a bit.
Plans to support custom state serializers for reliable actors. Where are we on that?
If you're using the reliable collections as the state manager for actors, there is a place you can plug in to add custom serialization the same way you would with reliable collections.
Yeah.
So when you set up your actor service in your program main, reliable collection state provider in your program main, when you register the service type and the actor type, there's a place where there's a Lambda where you instantiate the actor service. You can plug in the reliable collection state manager instead of the default one, and then you can configure that the same way that you would with reliable collections. Yeah, state manager.
As far as an actual override for the existing one or the default one.
For the default one, there's no way to do it though.
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't.
I know that's an enhancement that we're working on, but I don't know when it would show up.
Yeah.
Right now, if you have, if net data contract serializer just isn't doing it for you, which we understand, then swapping out for the dictionary state provider and then configuring that state manager, just like the link that you pointed to.
Yep.
Then plugging that into the actor model is kind of the way to do it.
That's the way to do it. Yep.
Any plans for a lighter weight Azure deployment scenario for Service Fabric applications, something along the lines of web workers, where you deploy low resource Service Fabric applications without incurring the cost of a full cluster, and you just pay for resource usage? Well,
I think this comes down to, at the moment we say one node for this, but I mean one node is still only for testing purposes.
Yeah.
So the state of where we have with Service Fabric, the minimum in production we say is 5 machines. There can be 5 machines sized to the type of workload that you have. You can test down to 3, and then we do have 1 for dev test purposes. That's what we introduced effectively recently. So,
but I think he's asking about a production environment where he doesn't see the environment, doesn't see the infrastructure.
So yes, we don't have that today.
Yeah, we don't have that today. Yes. But it is something that I think we're thinking about, right? We've heard this feedback before.
We've heard this feedback before, and that's something that we look towards a future plan. It's certainly a thing that we're considering.
Yeah. Let's see here.
For Graceful shutdown, does Service Fabric fire an event when the node goes down? Yeah, there should be a trace that comes
we
out.
do, but normally what happens before the node goes down, your services are already down. And so typically what there is, for example, the example in Azure is the Azure load balancer has what they call health probes. And they probe on a particular port, and if they experience some failures on that port, then the Azure load balancer removes that node from its table for receiving. And so typically what we see people do is they integrate with those probes, or the probes that are like that whatever their front end or load balancer has, so that, say, an upgrade is coming through, either at the infrastructure level or your application upgrade is coming through. And Service Fabric calls your service to stop. It closes all the communication listeners. What you typically do is you close the communication listener for the health probe. You close the communication listener that actual traffic is coming into the service on, but you don't complete the closed calls until all the operations have drained out, right? So you've stopped new ones from coming in, both from the networking Azure load balancer layer, and just in case anything does show up at that service, it's going to get rejected and bounce and go somewhere else so that it gets a chance to drain out. And then once those drains are complete, the service is closed down completely, and the node, whatever that upgrade is that's happening, gets a chance to complete. That integration with that networking thing is kind of the cleanest way to do it. You could, of course, just close the communication stack that the service actually has, and just start bouncing things. Most load balancers will see those types of failures and redirect traffic after a few tries anyway. But the health checks is really the integrated way that gives the smoothest experience without returning errors to the client. So that's typically how we would see that work.
Yeah. So can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the load balancer that I'm going to have to be using is a F5 load balancer.
Yep.
And so the idea is that I would write the stuff in there to integrate with Service Fabric's health checking that would say, and there's an event in there that says, hey, this is going down.
Yeah.
Is that what I understood from that?
You could do that. Another way to do it is you could rely on address changes of the service. So whenever the service moves or whenever the service shuts down, its addresses change, and there are events, notifications that you can subscribe to from Fabric client that you get this notification that says, hey, the address of this thing changed. If you're using that to just populate the table that the load balancer is routing to, you kind of get to skip out on all of this. You don't really care why it's moving. You don't know if it's an upgrade or it failed or whatever.
Oh, that is brilliant.
And that way you just skip out on all that complexity. And just whenever the address is changed, you just plug it in and that's the set.
And I wouldn't even need a reverse proxy at that point. I could just run it all through there and just say this
that's exactly what
goes
you do.
through here.
That looks similar to
Is there
what
a doc or
integration with
something
API
somewhere
management
that...
is.
Sorry, say that again, sorry.
No, I said that pattern is similar to what we're showing as a part of our integration with Azure API management. Is instead of using the Azure load balancer, which is going to spray and then you have to figure everything out, you have more of that proxy thing built in so that the proxy and the balancing is kind of one utility.
Yeah. Is there a doc somewhere that talks about that event of the movement of the...
I'll see if I can find it.
You could just
okay. If not, I can Google it up. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hi, I have a question here.
Go.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're talking our questions. We have 3 minutes to go.
Yeah. It's time for the lightning round.
Yeah.
Okay, just a quick thing is we were trying to do a POC at our workplace, and what I did was I've already done the security for node-to-node cluster as well as client-to-node cluster, but what I'll be looking for is security on the application level. So do you have anything like a Windows authentication or integrated authentication kind of thing for application security?
Security between your app is up to how we don't get in the way of that, of how you build the security between your apps. So whether are you specifically talking about Windows integrated security or some other form like CERT?
We were looking for Windows authentication. If not, then if there's if we know that there's OAuth and there's a certificate, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
But,
you can do certificate between your machines over HTTPS, and that's one thing. Using whatever the web stack is that you're using, and same with integrated auth. However you're calling between machines that uses integrated auth, that would have to support that. So it really comes down to the protocol and the stack they're using to talk.
Yeah. So remember, any Service Fabric runs as a process on your Windows box if that's the scenario for Windows integration. So it's just a process on the Windows box. And going back to the thing we talked about before, whatever identity that actually runs that process, you would have the same if you would have had that would be any other service running.
So is this on premise?
Yeah, it's on premise. Yeah.
So exactly. So if it's deployed on premise, you can make all your processes run using the run as feature under a particular Active Directory account, for example, and then whatever you call where it has that identity, whether it calls. So say you're calling a SQL Server database, you can call a SQL Server database and hand the identity of the process you're running under, and that all works.
So there's another question about HTTP sys web listener, Kerberos.
Yeah, so if you're using Web Listener, when you instantiate Web Listener, you can pass in a settings object, and in that settings object, you can configure different kinds of auth. It has NTLM, Kerberos, and a couple others in there.
So even though you don't have IIS in those scenarios for web frontend, .NET Core will support that as well.
Yeah, that's all in that kernel driver. And the Windows HTTP Server API.
Actually, to go back to the question, like how do you authenticate the user in the application level? And the thing is, we want to put a parameter kind of thing around the application so that if when you deploy another application on the Service Fabric, both the application no one should be able to access the microservice from another application, right? So that's why we wanted to get that security going, application level security.
Have you chosen how you're communicating between your services? Are you using, what are you using? Are you using?
Connection between the services is using the listener, right? The web listener.
So HTTP?
HTTP, yes.
Yeah, HTTP, yeah.
So does .NET Core support Windows authentication?
Yeah, so like I said, using Web Listener, when you instantiate Web Listener, there's a settings object you can pass in to configure if you want to set up NTLM or Kerberos authentication.
Okay. All right.
But then, and then you have to check the actual user roles to figure out whether you
of course,
have access or not.
Yeah, that's right.
So to answer the question, you use run as to run it under a particular account. As Vaz just said, you can then do Windows authentication with the whatever if you're using .NET Core stack, and then you check that token on the client side. You check the client token on the server side when the call gets made, which I presume will probably be something like adding some property to your method, and then it'll authenticate against who's calling you. I don't know the details of that one.
I don't know the details off the top of my head either, but
there's no. I think the point is there's nothing in there. Once you get to that point, there's nothing specific into how you do that in Service Fabric, or you would do it in any other process that you run that has remote communication.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's really up to the application framework you're using on top of Service Fabric, which in this case would be ASP.NET Core.
Yeah. So the only
they have those features available.
The only Service Fabric thing is to make it use run as to run it under the particular account in the first place.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is there a recommended way to get EDW cluster nodes? Yeah, there's a few ways that you can look into
off the cluster.
No, he's answering the question.
Is it not just using like Windows Azure Diagnostics?
That is only
So IaaS Diagnostics or WAD Windows Azure Diagnostics configuration can pull it into table storage. The problem with table storage is it's fairly hard to find stuff in there.
And you need to remember to delete stuff, otherwise it gets really heavy. And we don't have a way to automatically remove those traces.
Yeah, but what IaaS Diagnostics or WAD also can do for you is can use syncs to actually not put it into table storage before write it into either application insights. You can also have OMS, Operations Management Suite, picking it up from table storage, or you can send it directly from WAD or IaaS Diagnostics to something else.
Well, you can also use
Event Hub, I think.
Yeah, or you can use Eventflow actually and not use IaaS Diagnostics or WAD, because you can set the EDW provider of our traces as one of your Eventflow data sources in your Eventflow configuration, and that will pick up all the node level data as well and send that directly to App Insights or any other solution you choose to use. That way you don't have to use storage, so you don't have those costs, and you can easily turn that off whenever you want just by pushing an update to your application or wherever your Eventflow config lives.
Yeah, so basically the trade-off there is that you move the configuration of those diagnostic pipelines from being a cluster level configuration to being an app level or service level configuration, if that's what you want to do. But if you want to have the cluster logs,
you got the cluster logs.
You can pipe them there as well. But I guess the recommended way right now, because if you go and create a cluster in Azure through the portal today, and you enable application insights, which you can do by default, we actually set the sync up for you. So all the cluster level logs and whatever service level logs and event sources you specify as part of this what configuration would actually be piped into application insights.
I run an on-prem cluster upgrade with ps command start service fabric cluster upgrade. The manifest version in the doc refers to v2, but that's not being accepted.
It should be, so when you look at this, I'll send you a link to the doc. It should be the name of the version you're trying to upgrade to, yes? So say we just released 5.6 as a release. The name of that package is 5.6 dot, same number after that. So you say start Service Fabric manifest upgrade, and then you say give the code package version as 5.6.219, whatever the number was, as part of that upgrade. That's the version number there.
I think we just put that link out there.
Yes.
So there's documentation for it.
I guess that's it.
All right.
Okay.
Did we get around to it?
I think we cleared it out. Yeah. All right.
That was my question.
Marcin.
Yeah.
What you got?
Yeah, I think we skipped one.
Did we skip him?
Yeah, we did.
Crap.
We recognize his voice.
We got everybody's besides Marcin. Marcin, your question quota, you've exceeded your question quota. You'll need to apply to ops to increase the question quota. No, the question was, I got it. Here it is. Question about custom serialization. Yeah, in that case, so long as it's serializable by both, by whatever serializer is there, so long as the type can be serialized and deserialized, then you're fine. The situation that you end up in is a lot of the times either it's not, or the type was introduced before it was available everywhere. So even though the serializer might be able to do with it, when it deserializes it and tries to give you a type back, that type doesn't exist in that other process. So that's why we always recommend a multi-phase upgrade if you've got that problem, where you introduce the type, you make sure it's everywhere before you touch it or use it in any actual code. That's just to deal with situations where the primary or the secondary gets upgraded first, and then when you're putting data in, it has to be able to be pulled out of the other side. Hopefully that quick version answers your question. There is a doc on handling this.
Perfect. Look, someone even posted an example of how to do upgrade.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, final question, updates on Service Fabric reliable services on Linux.NET Core. We're working towards that.
So that's something we're working on too. We're actually trying to port.
That is wrong.
Yeah,
That's wrong.
Yeah, that's
What Sweeney says is wrong.
Yeah,
You guys are just interrupting. That's
Sorry.
great. Help the guy out. Let Voss talk.
Stateful services on Linux and .NET Core. So around the Ignite conference in September, we're working on porting the reliable collection stack. Chaco's just absolutely determined to not let me answer this question.
Shut up.
.NET Standard
September.
2.0.
Right?
Mikkel.
That's the short answer.
You and me right now. Killing his balls. Yes, .NET Standard 2.0, the reliable collection stack, we're working on porting that to .NET Standard 2.0, so then you'll be able to run it on .NET Core in both Windows and Linux.
Yes.
And that's around September.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, is there another question you guys would like to answer?
Yeah, Chaco.
Yeah, Chaco? Chaco,
Sorry.
since you're so hot to answer this question.
No, which one?
Which question? Are you kidding me, man?
Someone pasted in that PowerShell command. Chaco had a comment that it
Yes.
wasn't right.
Just answer the question.
Okay, I'll answer the question
Yes.
on that.
Yeah.
Yes,
Don't worry.
that's the best way to do it.
Okay.
So
I think that's it. Yes.
we've already answered.
Right.
You guys mentioned that there is a doc about that custom serialization. Can someone post that link to that doc in the chat, please?
Sure.
Yeah, we can probably find that for you.
Yep.
You got it.
There's holidays going on right now?
Holidays.
Where's the holidays?
Marcin's on the holidays.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there's a holiday somewhere.
Somewhere.
In the world.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in Spain.
What?
Then there's always
Spain
a
has
holiday?
more national holidays than any other country.
Oh,
There
let's
you
move
go.
to Spain. There you go.
Well, let's go to Spain then. What are we doing here?
I know. Right. Should we do this? We should find
That's useless to know.
My daughter lives there. She has
Oh, okay. That's why you know.
All right.
You guys have a bank holiday in Poland. Wow, that's nice.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
We'll see you next month.
Yeah.
7:20.
Watch for the 7:20. We'll watch for the
7:20.
announcement to come up on the blogs. We'll try to let you know as well. As always, just let us know if you have any other questions. There's the GitHub issues list.
Which is posted in the links,
Yep.
so feel
Yeah.
free to check that out.
Yeah,
And-
Tell your friends to come along.
Yes,
Yes, of
please.
course.
We have an objective of getting this as high as we can. We want to hit 100 people if we can. So
So,
tell your friends.
and your kids.
Yeah. Bring your families and talk.
Sure.
Bye.
All right.
Thanks.
All right,
Thank
thanks,
you, everybody.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
See you next time.